Well, this Christmas is sure to be remembered by some of you as the Christmas of the toques. And my goodness, I think this is one of the prettiest I've seen. Norma Jean Maines has been providing knitting lessons to family members and just about anybody who shows an interest. The woman who inspired all of this is here to explain herself and her mission. It's great to welcome back Janine Maxwell.
Thank you.
From a place with no snow.
There's no snow in Georgia. It's awesome.
Atlanta, Georgia's home. And I want to say right off the bat, everybody says, oh, did you knit that vest? You knitting person? No, that's not a home
Sadly, I did
effort.
not knit it. And no.
But it's a wonderful showpiece for a woman who has people knitting not just across Canada, not just in the US of A. This is your local Starbucks group, isn't it?
That's right.
That's done this one. But where are people knitting for Africa?
It is crazy. We started this campaign just a couple of months ago, and we thought, you know, let's try to get 15,000 toques, or beanies as we call them in the States. And I sent out a couple of emails, and they went viral. So we have women knitting toques in Japan, in China, in Scotland, in Nigeria, Malawi, Kenya, England, in more than half of the states of the United States. I think we only have 5 Canadian provinces, so we're still missing a few provinces here. But there's more than 160 women's groups that are knitting these toques to send over to Africa in July of next year.
This may be a kind of a mental challenge for some, toques for a hot country. The reason being,
it's cold.
At night.
That's right. It's cold at night, and Swaziland is the country that these are going to, and it's a little tiny country in South Africa, and we get frost on the ground at night in winter.
The good news is we've already had 1,200 hats come here to Crossroads. We need these toques by February 1st.
That's right.
To this building, and we're going to come back to this because this is part of a much bigger story. Janine said to me just before the camera came on, you know, I can't even relate to my corporate life, my life in the very successful business world, and yet in Heart for Africa, which you co-founded, you're using your gifts.
Well, I think so. I hope so. You know, when I left business in 2004, when we closed our company and really felt the calling to work in Africa, you know, and often people say, well, how did you know you were called? You just know. When God is asking you to do something, there's just no question. And so my husband and I founded Heart for Africa, and we were working, you know, in Swaziland and Malawi and Kenya. But the situation there is, as I know that you know, and I know that your listeners are starting to hear more and more about what's happening in Africa, but it's beyond crisis. And so we are being called to use our gifts in marketing and advertising and things like that to be able to help these children.
Swaziland has the highest incidence of AIDS on the continent.
It does, in the world, in fact. The statistics will show that it's about 42.6% of the entire population, but if you go on the ground and you speak to the medical field there, they'll say it's probably 56% of the population who is currently infected.
Life expectancy?
Is 29 years old, and it's predicted, again, that without immediate international intervention, there will be no adults by the year 2020.
Now, Janine, you and your ministry represent a whole paradigm shift in how we're doing missions. You used to say, and you still believe, in the value of one, but you've had to.
Well, we've had to change that. You know, I speak all over Canada and all over the United States. In fact, I speak all over the world on helping in Africa and not just handing out. We don't hand things out. It's not about giving things, although we're giving toques out, but it's about coming alongside and helping Africans help Africans. And I learned that from Jim Cantillon. You know, he's been a huge influence in my life and in our ministry. I remember being in a pastor's conference with him in Kenya in 2005, and we'd just closed our business, and I wasn't even really in ministry, and I crashed his conference to see what a pastor's conference was in Africa, and it really flipped my whole world upside down. And I understand the importance of one, and Jesus died for one, and we must be really concerned about that one child, but
the value of
human life, and that Jesus died for one. But in this country of Swaziland, where the population has gone from 1.1 million down to 950,000 in just 3 or 4 short years, we now have 200,000 orphans.
Oh my. What was it when you first?
It was about 70,000 4 years ago.
Orphans. So from 70,000 to 200,000.
With 8,000 new orphans every month. And what you see when you're in Swaziland is the families live in homesteads. They don't live in villages like many other countries in Africa. So many of them are polygamist. So you'll have a man who marries and builds his wife a house, gets another wife, and he builds them each a home. And then each of them might have 6 or 8 or 10 children, which that's their culture, that's their life, that's their future. So when the man brings HIV into that homestead and infects each of the wives, as they die in front of these children, what we find is 50 or 60 children living alone. And they're not in a village setting where the village can raise that child. They may be a very, very long walk from the next homestead. And if you were to walk from one homestead to the next, you might find another 50 or 60 children living alone. In fact, the biggest number to me is that there are 15,000 orphan-headed households in this tiny country of Swaziland.
And these are tragically serial orphans because they've lost one after another caregiver, parent figure.
And they've buried them all. They went and dug the holes, they've wrapped them in blankets, and then they're left sitting with nothing. And no hope, no food, no clothing. But without hope, we have nothing.
No reason.
No reason.
So what's the new approach for Heart for Africa?
Well, we have, for the last few years, we've been coming alongside children's homes and helping them to achieve self-sustainability so that they can care. A children's home is an orphanage, so helping the orphanage be able to care for those children. And yet the numbers are so big that as I look at it this past summer and we're saying, okay, Lord, what are we supposed to do? You know, there's 200,000 orphans. It's wonderful that we have 150 in 3 homes and 150 in Kenya. And so now we have 300, this is great. But what about the other 200,000 that are living alone? And the answer is the church. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning because there are 6,000 churches in Swaziland. And it's such a crisis that we have to start feeding these kids today. We can't, you know, programs are great and education is great, but if the kids aren't in school, they're not being educated. And if they're not in school, they're not eating, because that's typically where they get all of their food, is that meal program at the schools.
Exactly.
And so what if the church was to rise up and truly start caring for the orphans and widows in their community? And that's what we're called to do. Sadly, in Swaziland, they're not doing it. In Canada, we're not doing it very well. In America, we're not doing it very well. I think the church is not only asleep here in North America, but the church is asleep in Swaziland. And so many pastors don't even know who the orphans are in their